Chapter 1. The Garden Party That Never Ended. The village of Little Hollingbury had always been a place where the clocks ticked just a little slower, and the daily news was served best alongside a warm cup of tea and a slice of Victoria sponge. Tucked away in the gentle folds of the English countryside, its neat rows of cottages, the village green, and the ancient parish church gave the impression of a timeless idyll, one that had known little disturbance beyond the usual ebb and flow of gossip and harvest fairs. This particular June day, however, held something a hint more unusual, something that sent ripples through the placid surface of village life. It was the day of the annual garden party at Ashgrove Manor, a sprawling estate on the village's outskirts. The party was a fixture in the social calendar, a rare chance for the entire community, landowners, tradesfolk, and the local clergy, to gather in a congenial atmosphere, trading news, pleasantries, and the occasional veiled comment. Miss Jane Marple, comfortably settled in her favorite wicker chair at the edge of the rose garden, had been watching the proceedings with her usual quiet amusement. Age had brought her a measure of invisibility, an unnoticed corner from which she could observe humanity in its endless varieties. Her eyes, sharp as ever, traced the movement of villagers and visitors alike, cataloging nuances of expression and manner that others often missed. The host, Lord Ashgrove, a gentleman of some standing with a penchant for rare books, was presiding over his guests with a practiced grace. His wife, Lady Ashgrove, carried herself with the delicate air of a woman accustomed to being admired, her smile radiant yet slightly forced, like a butterfly's wing caught in a breeze. Together, they had orchestrated the event to perfection, or so it seemed. Clusters of guests milled about beneath the dappled shade of ancient oaks, sipping champagne and sampling finger sandwiches. The local vicar, Reverend Humphrey, was deep in discussion with the village doctor, while Mrs. Clement, the innkeeper's wife, seemed intent on stirring the gossip mill with a barely concealed gleam in her eye. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward a slender figure standing somewhat apart near a marble fountain, a man in his late 30s, impeccably dressed but carrying an air of restless energy. It was Mr. Edward Hargrove, a recent arrival to Little Hollingbury, known mostly for his extensive collection of rare books and a curious habit of disappearing into the library for hours at a stretch. He had spoken little to the villagers, and rumor had it he was working on some mysterious manuscript. "Quite a gathering, isn't it, Miss Marple?" Lady Ashgrove's voice was soft as a summer breeze as she approached, her eyes bright with practiced civility. "Indeed, Lady Ashgrove. Little Hollingbury comes alive today," Jane replied, inclining her head politely. "There is a certain charm in the familiarity of it all, don't you think? Though I must confess, Edward's presence adds a touch of intrigue." Miss Marple smiled, a subtle twitch at the corner of her lips. Intrigue is often just what we fail to see. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden murmur rising from the crowd. A pale young woman, Miss Lucy Bell, daughter of the village grocer, was standing near the edge of the rose beds, her hands trembling as she clutched a small leather-bound book. Her eyes darted nervously about, finally settling on Lord Ashgrove. I found something," she stammered, voice barely above a whisper. "In the library." The assembled guests fell into a hush as Lord Ashgrove stepped forward, his brow furrowed. "What is it, Lucy?" She hesitated before lifting the book. It was an old volume, its leather worn and edges frayed, yet strangely warm to the touch. The cover bore no title, only a delicate embossing of a puzzle-like pattern, interlaced lines forming an enigmatic knot. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. She recognized that pattern, an ancient symbol often associated with secrets and hidden knowledge. Before anyone could speak further, a loud crash echoed from within the manor. A moment later, the butler appeared at the garden's edge, his face ashen. "Lord Ashgrove," he said gravely. "There's been an incident in the library. Mr. Hargrove, he's been found dead." The words hung in the air like a sudden frost, chilling the warmth of the afternoon. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, her heart steady but her mind alight. The garden party, so full of laughter and whispered confidences just moments before, had become the scene of something far darker. As villagers whispered among themselves, eyes wide with shock and suspicion, Miss Marple knew that beneath the manicured lawns and painted smiles, old secrets were stirring. Secrets that had been locked away, much like the mysterious book now held tightly in young Lucy Bell's trembling hands. This was no ordinary death, and Jane Marple, with her quiet understanding of human nature, was already piecing together the puzzle that had suddenly thrown little Hollingbury into chaos. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as the crowd slowly dispersed from the garden, the festive mood shattered. The village constable, a burly man named Sergeant Reynolds, took charge, cordoning off the library and beginning his own inquiries. Miss Marple lingered near the fountain, watching the faces of those gathered, their unease, their concealed glances, and subtle shifts in posture, revealing a tapestry of fear, guilt, and hidden tensions. Mrs. Clement approached, whispering conspiratorially, "Did you hear about Edward and that strange book? Some say he was onto something that could upset more than just the peace of the village." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the smallest things reveal the greatest truths, Mrs. Clement. We must watch carefully." As twilight settled over Little Hollingbury, the village seemed to hold its breath. A puzzle had been laid before Miss Marple, one that would unravel the quiet veneer of this peaceful place, exposing the human frailties and jealousies that lay beneath. And so, the game had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers Among the Willows. The sun dipped lower behind the rolling hills, casting a soft amber glow over Little Hollingbury. The village, usually so serene in the evening hush, was now abuzz with restless whispers and uneasy glances. The garden party had long since broken up, but the shock of Edward Hargrove's sudden death at Ashgrove Manor lingered heavily in the air. In the little cluster of shops on the high street, the familiar faces of the villagers gathered in twos and threes, voices low but fervent, sharing theories and suspicions with all the zeal that only a close-knit community can muster when one of their own meets an untimely end. At the village bakery, the scent of fresh bread mingled with the sotto voce speculations. Mrs. Clement stood near the counter, her arms crossed, watching the stream of customers with an expression that was both curious and guarded. She had made it her business to know everyone's affairs, and this latest incident gave her more material than she had hoped for. "I tell you," she said to the baker, a stout man named Mr. Peters, "there's more to this than meets the eye. That book Mr. Hargrove was so secretive about, something about it upsets someone. You can see it in the way the Ashgroves look, especially Lady Ashgrove. She's trying to hold her breath till it all blows over." Mr. Peters nodded, wiping flour from his hands. "I overheard the vicar talking to the doctor. They reckon Edward was no ordinary book collector. Some say he was digging into family secrets. You know how these things go. Dig too deep, and you'll stir up trouble." Meanwhile, at the post office, Miss Emily Fairfax, the village's longtime letter carrier and observer of human nature, sat behind the counter. Her keen eyes caught every flicker of emotion, every hesitation in speech. A group of schoolchildren gathered nearby, whispering excitedly about the event, their youthful voices filled with the thrill of mystery and fear. Miss Marple, passing by on her way home, paused briefly to nod at Miss Fairfax. "Such news travels fast, Emily," Jane said gently. "Faster than I'd like," Emily replied with a sigh. "The village hasn't been the same since. Some people are frightened, Others are whispering about blame. It's hard not to get caught up in it." Jane smiled softly, her gaze drifting across the street toward the dim silhouette of the village church, where the flicker of candlelight hinted at evening prayers. The vicar, Reverend Humphrey, was likely preparing a sermon that would speak to the troubled hearts of his parishioners. And of that evening, the village hall was open for those who wished to gather and seek solace in shared grief or to voice their speculations in a more organized way. The room was filled with a mixture of anxious faces and those eager to make sense of the tragedy. Miss Marple found herself seated near the back, a quiet observer once again, as the villagers took turns to speak. Mrs. Clement was the first to break the uneasy silence. "It's clear to me that Mr. Hargrove's death was no accident. There's something off about that library scene. Who else knew about that book he was hiding?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. "Why would someone want to kill a man over a book?" asked Mr. Thompson, the local schoolmaster, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Unless the book contained secrets worth killing for. Or a manuscript worth a fortune," added a young woman, Miss Hazel Gray, who had recently moved to the village and worked as a journalist for a city paper. Her sharp eyes scanned the room, as if searching for reactions. Miss Marple caught her gaze briefly, noting a flicker of calculation behind the polite smile. "Do you really think money was the motive?" she whispered to herself. Before anyone could answer, Reverend Humphrey stood to speak, his calm voice silencing the room. "Let us remember that Mr. Hargrove was a man of letters, a scholar perhaps misunderstood by many of us," he said. "We do not yet know the circumstances of his death. I urge caution and kindness. The truth will come to light in time." His words, while soothing, did little to quell the undercurrent of suspicion. Later that night, as little Hollingbury settled into uneasy slumber, Miss Marple sat by her hearth with a cup of tea, her thoughts weaving through the fragments of the day. The village was a tapestry of secrets, some obvious, others carefully concealed. Her mind returned to the book that Lucy Bell had found, the strange volume with the puzzle-like embossing. What was its significance? Why had Edward Hargrove guarded it so fiercely? And who among the villagers had reason to fear its contents? The answers would not be found in loud accusations or hasty judgments, Jane knew. They would come from patience, quiet observation, and a willingness to listen to what was said, and what was left unsaid. The following morning, the village awoke to a brisk breeze and the distant crowing of roosters, but the tension was palpable. The constable's office was busy as Sergeant Reynolds began interviewing villagers one by one. Miss Marple decided to visit the local tea room, a hub of conversation and a place where she could hear the whispers that might never reach the ears of the police. Inside, the air was warm with the smell of freshly brewed tea and baked scones. The proprietor, Mrs. Havisham, was wiping a teacup with a cloth, her eyes flickering with curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she greeted. "The whole village seems to be holding its breath." "Good morning, Mrs. Havisham," Jane replied. "And what are they whispering about today?" Mrs. Havisham leaned in, lowering her voice. "Some say Edward was no stranger to enemies. He wasn't exactly a favorite here, you know. His sharp tongue and those books he kept locked away, many thought him an outsider." "Outsiders often have secrets," Jane murmured. Across the room, a trio of women chatted quietly. Miss Agnes Collins, the schoolteacher, Mrs. Edith Lowe, the vicar's wife, and Mrs. Margaret Birch, a widow known for her sharp wit and deep knowledge of village history. Their conversation touched on the Ashgroves. Lady Ashgrove, in particular, was the subject of much speculation. "She's too poised for someone so shaken," Mrs. Birch said. "I wouldn't be surprised if she knew more than she lets on." Agnes shook her head. "And Lord Ashgrove, so calm, so measured. It's almost as if he expected this. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. Calm, poised, expecting. These were traits often worn to mask inner turmoil. That afternoon, Jane made her way to the village library, a modest building opposite the church. Inside, she found the librarian, Miss Clara Heath, a quiet woman with spectacles perched on the tip of her nose. "Miss Marple?" Clara said with a small smile. "I heard about Mr. Hargrove's passing. Such a loss for those who appreciate the written word." Jane nodded. "Yes, I am particularly curious about this book that was found at the garden party." Clara hesitated before responding. "It's unusual. No title, no author, just that strange embossing. I haven't seen anything like it in the collection." "Do you know if anyone else had access to Ashgrove's private library?" Jane asked. "The staff is small and loyal," Clara replied. "But Mr. Hargrove was a private man. He rarely allowed visitors except for Lord Ashgrove and on occasion his wife." Jane made a mental note. The inner circle was small, and that often meant that any secret kept within those walls could be fiercely protected. As the day waned, Miss Marple returned home, her mind busy untangling the web of observations and half-truths. She knew the villagers were watching her as well, curious about her quiet presence amid the turmoil. Her cat, a plump tabby named Poppy, leapt onto her lap as she settled with her notebook. One thing was clear. The answers would lie not in the obvious, but in the subtle. The fleeting glance, the slight hesitation, the words spoken between the lines. And Jane Marple was nothing, if not patient. Thus, the village of Little Hollingbury began to show its true face, one of whispered fears, hidden motives, and a puzzle that would test the keenest mind in the quiet English countryside. Miss Marple was ready to listen and to watch. For in the shadows of gossip and grief, the truth waited patiently to be uncovered. Chapter 3: Quiet Observations and Hidden Patterns. The morning after the garden party, Little Hollingbury awoke to a world still unsettled by Edward Hargrove's death. Though the sun shone brightly and the birdsong filled the air, the village carried an undercurrent of unease, as if a delicate thread holding the fabric of their peaceful lives had been frayed beyond repair. Miss Marple, as always, moved with the unassuming grace of one who belonged to the landscape itself. An elderly lady in her familiar tweed coat and soft hat, her eyes twinkling with an unspoken wisdom. Though the villagers often overlooked her, Jane's mind was busily weaving together the fragments she had gathered. The morning began quietly with Jane's customary stroll along the village lanes. The scent of honeysuckle and freshly mown grass filled the air, but her attention was far from the simple pleasures of the countryside. Each face she passed was a page in the unfolding story, and Jane was intent on reading them carefully. Near the village green, she encountered Miss Hazel Gray, the young journalist who had made waves at the village hall the evening before with her incisive remarks. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Hazel greeted, her voice cordial yet carrying a note of calculated curiosity. "Good morning, Miss Gray. How do you find Little Hollingbury in the bright light of day?" Jane inquired gently. Hazel smiled, but there was something guarded in her eyes. "Quieter, perhaps too quiet. But the story is just beginning, isn't it?" Jane's eyes softened. A good mystery often reveals more about the people than the events themselves. Hazel nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose that's why you're the village's quiet detective." Jane smiled demurely. "One learns to listen when words are scarce." Their brief conversation was interrupted by a shrill voice from across the street. "Jane! Jane Marple!" called Mrs. Clement, bustling over with her usual briskness, cheeks flushed from exertion or excitement. It was often hard to tell which. "I thought I might find you here," she said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Have you heard? There's talk about a will." Jane's eyebrows arched slightly. A will, Mrs. Clement? Yes, the late Mr. Hargrove's will, Mrs. Clement said, glancing around as if expecting the walls to have ears. Some say he made changes recently. People are speculating that there might be more to this than just a book. Jane nodded slowly. I've heard whispers, but a will can reveal many things. Old grudges, new alliances, perhaps even motives. Mrs. Clement nodded eagerly. Exactly. And you know how these village secrets can twist and turn. Later that morning, Miss Marple visited the Ashgrove estate under the pretext of offering condolences to Lady Ashgrove, a visit the family had not refused. The manor's grand facade stood silent and imposing beneath the morning sun, the flowers in the garden seeming less vibrant than the day before. Lady Ashgrove greeted Jane with a measured smile, eyes tired but resolute. "Thank you for coming, Miss Marple," she said softly. "It is a difficult time for us all." Jane observed the subtle tremor in Lady Ashgrove's hands as she poured tea. "Your Grace, it must be a great loss." Lady Ashgrove's gaze drifted toward the window, where a few gardeners worked in the distance. Edward was a complicated man. His presence at Ashgrove was always enigmatic. "Complicated men often leave tangled legacies," Jane remarked, her tone gentle but probing. "There were disagreements," Lady Ashgrove admitted, her voice dropping. "About the library, about the book. Edward was convinced it held a secret that could change everything." Jane's interest piqued. "And did you believe him?" Lady Ashgrove looked away, her eyes moist. "I wanted to, but he was stubborn. He barely spoke of it except in fragments. It seemed to consume him." Jane made a careful note of the flicker of emotion behind Lady Ashgrove's poised demeanor. Perhaps regret, perhaps fear. From Ashgrove Manor, Jane's path took her to the village school, where the day's lessons were underway, but shadows of the recent events lingered. Miss Agnes Collins, the schoolteacher, welcomed Jane warmly. "Such a dreadful shock, Jane," Agnes said, leading her through the quiet corridors. "The children ask questions, of course. It's hard to shield them from the reality, but they sense the tension." Jane glanced at a group of pupils huddled around a book, whispering about mysteries and detectives. "Curiosity is a natural instinct," Jane said, "and sometimes the questions we don't ask speak the loudest." Agnes nodded thoughtfully. "I'm concerned about the villagers' whispers. Suspicion can breed bitterness." Jane's gaze lingered on Agnes for a moment, noting her earnestness and the subtle strain in her voice. "And what do you think, Agnes? Who do you believe might be involved?" Agnes hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I cannot say. But the Ashgroves are not as united as they appear, and Edward's arrival upset many." Jane smiled faintly. "Sometimes the quietest waters conceal the deepest currents." By midday, Miss Marple had made her way to the village churchyard, where Reverend Humphrey was overseeing the preparations for a memorial service. His face was grave but composed. "Reverend," Jane greeted, "may I offer my condolences?" "Thank you, Jane. It is a heavy burden for the village," he replied. "I'm doing what I can to steady their spirits." "Do you sense anything unusual in the congregation?" Jane asked, carefully. The vicar considered before replying. "I've heard things. Uneasy murmurs, questions about Edward's past and his purpose here. Some suspect foul play, others fear secrets long buried." Jane nodded, reflecting on the delicate balance of faith and suspicion. "Do you believe the truth will bring peace?" she asked. "I hope so," he said quietly. "But the truth is often stranger than we expect." As the day drew on, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, where the steady ticking of the clock seemed almost out of place amid the swirling uncertainties. Sitting by the window, she penned notes from the day's encounters, each detail a thread she would soon weave into the greater tapestry. Her thoughts returned to the book, the enigma at the heart of the mystery. The peculiar embossing, the secrecy surrounding it, and the reactions of those closest to Edward all suggested that this was no ordinary volume. Her mind also lingered on the villagers, their faces, their gestures, the subtle hints of unease and guarded secrets. Mrs. Clement's insistence on a will, Lady Ashgrove's delicate sorrow tinged with fear, Miss Grey's probing questions, and Agnes Collins's worries about fractured loyalties all painted a complex picture. But Jane Marple was patient. She understood that the human heart is a labyrinth, full of hidden corridors and locked doors, and she knew that the truth would reveal itself not in sudden epiphanies, but in the quiet moments of observation, in the subtle shifts of behavior that most would overlook. That evening, as dusk settled over Little Hollingbury, Jane decided to revisit the scene of the crime, the Ashgrove Library. Under the pretense of assisting with organizing the books, she was granted permission to enter, accompanied by the reluctant librarian, Miss Clara Heath. The library was a sanctuary of aged wood and fading parchment, its heavy shelves lined with volumes that whispered stories of centuries past. At its center stood the spot where Edward had been found, now marked by a simple bouquet of wildflowers. Jane's eyes roamed the room, noting the placement of objects, the slight disarray on the desk, and the locked cabinet that stood apart. "The book was here," Clara said softly, "but now it's missing from the shelves." "Missing?" Jane echoed. Clara nodded. "No one knows where it is. After the incident, Lady Ashgrove took it for safekeeping," she said. Jane's gaze drifted toward the cabinet. "May I?" she asked, approaching. Clara hesitated, then nodded. With a careful hand, Jane opened the cabinet's door to reveal rows of neatly arranged manuscripts. Among them lay the puzzle book, its embossed cover glinting faintly in the lamplight. Jane lifted the book gently, tracing the intricate patterns with her finger. "This book," she murmured, "is the key." But the question remains. What secret does it hold, and who feared it enough to kill? The night deepened, but Miss Marple's mind remained alert, threading together the day's quiet observations. She understood now more clearly that this was a mystery rooted not merely in a single act of violence, but in the tangled webs of human desires, fears, and betrayals, woven through years of hidden grievances. And with each piece of the puzzle, the portrait of Little Hollingbury shifted, revealing shadows behind its tranquil facade. Miss Marple was ready to follow those shadows wherever they led. Chapter 4. The First Suspects and Quiet Doubts. The sun rose over Little Hollingbury with a pale, uncertain light, as though even the heavens were hesitant to greet the day after the turmoil of Edward Hargrove's death. The village awoke slowly, shadows of suspicion lingering in the corners of familiar faces and everyday routines. The garden party was a distant memory now, replaced by hushed conversations and furtive glances. At the center of the unfolding drama was the Ashgrove estate, where police activity had begun in earnest. Sergeant Reynolds, a man both respected and feared in equal measure, had taken charge of the investigation with a zeal fueled by the hope of a swift resolution. Miss Marple, ever observant yet outwardly unobtrusive, watched these developments with a quiet skepticism. She understood all too well the police's eagerness to find a culprit and close the case, but something in her intuitive sense told her that the truth was more complex, woven into the intricate fabric of the village's secrets. The morning began with a gathering at the village hall, where Sergeant Reynolds presented his preliminary conclusions to a room packed with villagers eager for answers. "We have identified our primary suspect," he announced firmly. Mr. Thomas Blackwood, the Ashgrove estate steward, was the last known person seen with Mr. Hargrove before the incident. A murmur spread through the crowd. Thomas Blackwood was a well-known figure in the village, steadfast, quiet, but with a reputation for being strict and sometimes harsh in his duties. Miss Marple watched carefully as Thomas rose, his face pale but composed. He cleared his throat. "I admit I had a disagreement with Mr. Hargrove the day before the party. There were tensions about the management of the library and certain restrictions he imposed. But I did not harm him. Sergeant Reynolds was unyielding. Disagreements can escalate. We found signs of forced entry in the library, and your fingerprints are on the broken window latch." Thomas's jaw tightened. "I was trying to retrieve a set of keys I'd accidentally dropped outside. I never intended any harm." The police seemed satisfied with this explanation, but Jane Marple remained thoughtful. The evidence was circumstantial, and the village was quick to jump on the nearest suspect. After the meeting, villagers lingered in the hall's antechamber, trading theories and casting glances that weighed heavily on Thomas's shoulders. Mrs. Clement approached Miss Marple, whispering with urgency, "It's too convenient, isn't it? Blame falls so easily on Thomas. But I've known him for years. He's rough, but not a murderer." Jane nodded. "Sometimes the obvious suspect is just a distraction." Nearby, Hazel Gray, the journalist, was scribbling notes rapidly, her expression keen and analytical. "He's a useful scapegoat," Hazel murmured to Jane. "But I'm not convinced." Jane smiled faintly. "Neither am I." Later that day, Jane arranged to speak privately with Thomas Blackwood, finding him at the edge of the village near the old mill, where he often took solitary walks. He greeted her with a nod, his usual reserve softened by fatigue. "Miss Marple," he began, "I appreciate your kindness. This whole ordeal is tearing the village apart." Jane regarded him steadily. "Tell me, Thomas, did you notice anything unusual about Mr. Hargrove's behavior in the days before the party?" Thomas hesitated, then said, "He was nervous. On edge. Often speaking in hushed tones, especially about that book. Said it held secrets that could ruin people. But he wouldn't say who or what exactly." Jane pressed gently. "Did he mention anyone who might want to harm him?" "No names," Thomas replied. "But there was tension with Lady Ashgrove. She wanted the book, or at least control over it. Edward refused." The mention of Lady Ashgrove made Jane's interest sharpen. "And Lord Ashgrove?" Thomas shrugged, quiet as always, but you could tell he was worried. He and Edward had disagreements too, though less openly. The afternoon brought Jane to the vicarage, where Reverend Humphrey and his wife Edith received her with their characteristic warmth. "Jane, it's good to see you," the Reverend said, leading her into the sitting room. "These are difficult times for the village." Jane settled into an armchair, watching the couple carefully. "Reverend Mrs. Humphrey, do you think the village is ready to hear the full truth?" The Reverend sighed deeply. "Some truths are hard to bear, but I believe honesty is necessary, if only to begin healing." Edith added quietly, "There are old wounds beneath the surface, family rivalries, debts, past grievances. Edward's arrival stirred them up." Jane nodded. "Did you notice any particular conflicts involving the Ashgroves or Mr. Hargrove?" Reverend Humphrey considered before replying, "Lord Ashgrove's family has a complicated history. Financial troubles and long-held secrets. Edward seemed intent on uncovering something, perhaps something the family wished to keep buried." Jane's mind raced. The will Mrs. Clement had mentioned the day before, the tensions between Edward and the Ashgroves, the mysterious book, these were threads waiting to be drawn together. In the early evening, Jane returned to her cottage, where a letter awaited her. It was from Miss Clara Heath, the librarian, who wrote of a recent discovery. Dear Miss Marple, the note read. While organizing some manuscripts, I found a folded piece of parchment hidden inside the puzzle book. It contains what appears to be a coded message. I thought you might wish to see it. Jane's curiosity was piqued anew. The mystery was deepening, the puzzle growing more intricate. She poured herself a cup of tea and began examining the letter, the coded symbols swirling before her eyes. That night, as the village slept uneasily, Miss Marple sat by the window with the cryptic parchment spread before her. The code was unfamiliar, a complex weave of letters and symbols that seemed deliberately designed to conceal its meaning. Jane's keen mind worked steadily, noting patterns and repetitions. Her fingers traced the embossed cover of the puzzle book lying nearby, the same interlaced knot that had first caught her attention. She understood now that this book and its hidden message were the fulcrum of the entire mystery, an ancient secret that someone would kill to protect. But who? Jane's thoughts turned to Lady Ashgrove's subtle fear, to Thomas's quiet desperation, to Hazel Gray's probing mind, and to the silent watchfulness of Lord Ashgrove himself. She knew better than to trust the surface of things. In mysteries such as these, the true culprit often hid behind a mask of innocence and respectability, weaving a web of deception that only the most patient observer could unravel. And Miss Marple was prepared to be just that. Patient, quiet, and ever watchful. The village of Little Hollingbury was holding its breath. The hunt for truth had begun. Chapter 5. A hidden clue in plain sight. The morning sun broke through a thin veil of mist that clung to the rolling fields around Little Hollingbury, casting long, pale shadows over the village lanes. The stillness of dawn seemed at odds with the undercurrent of tension that threaded through every home and shop, every whisper and sideways glance. The past days had shifted the village's gentle rhythm into something more uncertain, more fragile. Miss Marple, ever attuned to the smallest tremors in the human heart, sensed that the fragile surface of village life was beginning to crack. Beneath the polite conversations and constrained smiles, something far more significant was waiting to be uncovered. Jane began her day with a visit to the village post office, where Miss Emily Fairfax presided over the morning bustle. The letter carrier greeted her with a warm smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good morning, Jane," Emily said quietly. "There's talk about the Ashgrove Library, you know. People are saying there was more to that book than anyone realized." Jane nodded. "And what do they think, Emily?" "Some say the book was a key to something valuable, a secret ledger, a hidden fortune, or worse, a scandal that could ruin reputations," Emily replied, her voice low. "But others think it was a distraction, something to keep prying eyes busy while other plans were made." Jane smiled softly. "Rumors tend to grow like wildflowers, but often the truth is found in the roots." Afterwards, Miss Marple made her way to the village green, where a small group of villagers had gathered near the old willow tree. Their animated discussion quieted as Jane approached. Mrs. Clement greeted her eagerly. "Jane, there's something you must see." Intrigued, Jane followed the group to the base of the willow, where Miss Lucy Bell, the grocer's daughter, was kneeling beside a small wooden box. "I found this yesterday," Lucy explained, lifting the box gently. "It was buried near the old well, just under some loose stones. I thought it might be important." Jane examined the box carefully. It was unassuming, a simple oak container, weathered by time but intact. Inside, Jane found a folded parchment and a small, delicate key. The key to what, I wonder? Jane mused. Lucy shrugged. "I don't know, but it might be linked to that book Mr. Hargrove was so secretive about." Jane's mind raced. The discovery of the box was unexpected, but the timing was curious indeed. It might be the hidden clue she had been waiting for, a piece overlooked by others too caught up in suspicion and haste. That afternoon, Jane arranged to meet with Miss Clara Heath, the librarian, at the Ashgrove Library. The two women settled in the quiet sanctuary of books and shadows, the puzzle book resting between them on the polished desk. Clara handed Jane the parchment from the box, a coded message similar to the one Jane had studied the night before, but this one bore a fresh set of symbols, more complex and layered. "Have you managed to decode anything?" Clara asked. Jane shook her head. "Not yet, but the key you found might help. Keys often unlock more than just doors. They can unlock secrets." Jane carefully inserted the small key into a hidden compartment within the puzzle book's cover. With a soft click, a thin panel slid open, revealing a folded letter. The letter was written in a careful hand, its ink faded but legible. "To the one who finds this. Within these pages lies the truth long buried beneath the veneer of respectability. Trust not the obvious, but look to the shadows cast by those who smile too brightly. Seek the ledger hidden where the ivy clings to stone, and let the past speak before the present consumes all." Jane read the words aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "The ledger," she murmured. "That must be the secret Edward sought to protect." Clara's eyes widened. "Do you know where to look?" Jane smiled faintly. "I have my suspicions." Determined to follow the lead, Jane spent the following morning investigating the old manor grounds. The ivy-covered walls, ancient stone steps, and secluded alcoves seemed to hold their breath beneath the summer sun. At the base of a crumbling stone wall near the manor's eastern wing, Jane found an iron ring embedded in the mortar, almost invisible beneath the thick ivy. With the key in hand, she knelt and gently inserted it into a hidden lock mechanism near the ring. The ground trembled slightly as a small stone panel slid open, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside lay an old leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked and worn. Jane carefully pulled it free, the scent of aged paper rising to meet her. Back in the library with Clara's assistance, Jane opened the ledger to reveal pages filled with meticulous records, accounts, names, dates, and notes written in the margins. As she studied the pages, patterns emerged, transactions, debts, and payments that pointed to dealings far beyond the polite society of Little Hollingbury. One entry caught Jane's eye, dated just weeks before Edward's arrival. Settlement with Hargrove secured. Final payment withheld pending further review. Jane frowned. The ledger hinted at financial entanglements and perhaps blackmail or coercion. That evening, Miss Marple convened a quiet meeting with a select few: Lady Ashgrove, Thomas Blackwood, and Miss Hazel Grey. Each arrived with guarded expressions, aware that Jane's quiet gatherings often presaged revelations. Jane began carefully. "I have uncovered something that may shed light on the tension surrounding Mr. Hargrove and this village." She laid the ledger and the puzzle book on the table, watching their reactions. Lady Ashgrove's face tightened imperceptibly, her fingers clutching her handkerchief. Thomas's eyes flickered toward the ledger, a shadow crossing his usually stoic expression. Hazel Grey, ever alert, leaned forward. "What does it all mean?" Jane replied softly. "It means that Edward's death may have been the result of more than a personal dispute. It may be tied to long-standing secrets and financial pressures that some wished to keep buried." The room grew silent, the weight of Jane's words settling over them. Later that night, as Jane sat in her quiet cottage, the puzzle began to take shape. The hidden ledger, the coded messages, the secretive behavior of those closest to Edward. It all pointed toward a motive rooted in desperation and fear. But Jane knew that uncovering a secret was only part of the journey. The true test was to understand the human hearts entwined with those secrets, the jealousies, the betrayals, and the small cruelties that festered beneath the surface. And so, as the village lay in uneasy slumber, Miss Marple prepared herself for the confrontations that would soon come, for the puzzle of the book that never closed was far from solved. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Unveiled Secrets. The village of Little Hollingbury seemed to hold its breath beneath the gray clouds gathering overhead, as if nature itself anticipated the storm of revelations soon to break. The tranquil streets, once echoing with friendly chatter, now bore an undercurrent of unease that whispered through every crack in the village walls. The tension was no longer subtle. It had grown into a palpable weight, pressing down on everyone and everything. Miss Marple, ever the calm observer, had sensed the shift coming. The fragile veils of civility were beginning to tear, and beneath them lay the tangled threads of resentment, jealousy, and long-buried grudges. Today would mark a turning point. And the morning began with a summons to Ashgrove Manor. Lady Ashgrove had requested Miss Marple's presence for what she described as a necessary discussion. The atmosphere in the drawing room was thick with unspoken words, the heavy curtains drawn tight against the gloomy sky outside. Lady Ashgrove sat poised yet visibly strained, her delicate hands clasped tightly in her lap. Opposite her stood Lord Ashgrove, tall and reserved, his eyes shadowed with worry. Thomas Blackwood, the steward and erstwhile suspect, lingered near the doorway, his usual reticence replaced by a guarded alertness. Miss Hazel Grey arrived moments later, her sharp gaze flickering between the assembled group. The village journalist was a newcomer to these intimate circles, but her persistent curiosity had earned her a place at the table. Jane entered quietly, nodding a greeting. "You wish to see me, Lady Ashgrove?" "Yes, Jane," Lady Ashgrove replied with a thin smile. "It's time we face some truths, however painful." Lady Ashgrove began, her voice steady but tinged with regret. "Edward's death has brought much to light, secrets that some would rather keep hidden, but which now demand acknowledgement." Lord Ashgrove's gaze fell to the ledger Jane had uncovered, resting on the nearby table. That ledger, it tells a story not only of debts but of betrayals, of trust broken and loyalties questioned. Thomas Blackwood cleared his throat. "I have served this estate for over 20 years. I've seen the undercurrents of this family, the quiet struggles, and the clashes hidden behind closed doors. Mr. Hargrove stirred those waters, and some did not welcome it." Jane listened intently. "You speak of those who might have wished to keep certain matters concealed." Thomas nodded slowly. There were voices raised, threats whispered. Not from the family alone, but from others in the village who stood to lose if certain truths surfaced. Hazel Grey leaned forward, eyes bright with determination. "What kind of truths? And who were these others?" Lady Ashgrove hesitated. "I cannot name names, but there are those whose reputations depend on silence, those who benefited from arrangements made in the shadows." The conversation took on a tense edge as Lady Ashgrove's words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Jane sensed that the surface had barely been scratched, and that deeper waters were yet to be navigated. She turned her attention to Thomas. "Have you noticed any change in the behavior of the villagers since Edward's arrival?" Thomas considered. "Yes. Some have grown distant, others openly hostile. There are alliances forming, and old rivalries rekindled." Jane's mind raced. The village's delicate social fabric was fraying, and with it, the mask of tranquility was slipping. Later, Miss Marple visited the village pub, the King's Head, a place where villagers gathered to drown their fears or air grievances, sometimes both. The dim light and worn oak beams lent the room a somber tone, but beneath the surface, The conversations crackled with tension. Mrs. Clement, ever the busybody, was there, her eyes sharp as she greeted Jane with a knowing smile. "You'll find that secrets don't stay buried long in places like this," she said, nodding toward a group of men clustered near the hearth. Jane approached, listening as voices dropped when she neared. Mr. Henry Willis, the local carpenter, spoke in a low voice. "I tell you, there's more to Edward's death than we're being told. Some say the Ashgroves aren't as innocent as they pretend." Mr. Charles Green, a farmer, frowned. "And what of Thomas Blackwood? He's been acting strange, like he's carrying a burden he won't share." Jane interjected gently. "Sometimes the heaviest burdens are borne silently." As the evening drew on, Jane found herself back at her cottage, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts and impressions. She pored over the ledger once more, tracing the lines that connected names, debts, and whispered threats. Then, a knock at the door startled her. It was Lucy Bell, clutching a bundle of papers and looking distressed. "Miss Marple, I found these in my father's shop," she said breathlessly. "They're receipts and notes. Some mention Edward, and others hint at payments made in secret." Jane invited her in and spread the papers across the table. The handwriting was hurried, sometimes barely legible, but one thing was clear. There was a network of financial dealings involving key village figures, some of which overlapped with entries in the ledger. "This complicates things," Jane murmured. "It suggests that the motives behind Edward's murder reach beyond personal grudges to matters of greed and fear." Lucy nodded, tears in her eyes. "I don't want to believe anyone here could be capable of such things." Jane placed a comforting hand on the girl's shoulder. "Sometimes, Lucy, people do things they never imagined they could." The night deepened, and Jane sat by the flickering fire, contemplating the day's revelations. She thought of the villagers she had spoken with, their fears, their lies, and their concealed truths. She realized that the puzzle of the book that never closed was not just a mystery of a murder, but a mirror reflecting the darker facets of human nature. It was clear that more confrontations lay ahead, more secrets to be unveiled, and with each revelation, the true complexity of the case would emerge. As dawn approached, Miss Marple resolved to keep watching, listening, and gently drawing out the tangled threads. For only by facing the hidden shadows could the village hope to find the light of truth. Chapter 7. Another twist in the tale. The days that followed in Little Hollingbury were marked by a restless unease, the kind that settled deep into the bones of a village unaccustomed to disruption. The morning mists clung longer to the fields, and the usually lively market square felt subdued, as if the weight of secrets and suspicion had silenced its usual bustle. It was a village caught in the grip of a story whose ending remained stubbornly out of reach. Miss Marple, with her habitual calm and keen eyes, moved through this uneasy scene with the quiet assurance of one who knew that truth, like water, would find its way through even the narrowest cracks. Yet even she was not immune to surprise, for the puzzle of the book that never closed was beginning to reveal layers deeper and darker than she had anticipated. The morning began with a sharp knock at Miss Marple's door. She opened it to find Sergeant Reynolds standing there, his face unusually grave. "Miss Marple," he said, "we've had another incident." Jane's brow furrowed. "Another? What sort of incident?" "A break-in at Ashgrove Manor. Nothing stolen, at least not yet. But it seems someone is desperate to find that ledger and the book." Jane stepped back to let him in, her mind already piecing the implications together. The two walked swiftly to Ashgrove Manor, where the household was already abuzz with activity. Lord Ashgrove met them at the door, his expression strained. "We found the library disturbed," he explained. "Books moved. papers scattered, but nothing taken, yet. Miss Marple surveyed the room, noting the signs of a hurried search. The puzzle book and ledger lay undisturbed on a side table, but the sense of intrusion was unmistakable. "This tells us," Jane said thoughtfully, "that whoever came here was seeking something specific, something they believed might still be hidden." Reverend Humphrey arrived shortly after, having been called by Lady Satyavant Ashgrove. His calm presence seemed to steady the atmosphere. "This desperation speaks of guilt," he said quietly. "Those who fear exposure are often driven to reckless acts." Later that day, Miss Marple gathered the villagers for a meeting at the village hall, hoping to draw out information and observe reactions. The room was filled with familiar faces, each marked by worry and suspicion. Jane spoke carefully. "We must consider that the murderer may be among us still, driven by fear that secrets will come to light." Lady Ashgrove's hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "It is true. There are things in the ledger that could ruin lives, alliances forged in secrecy, debts hidden beneath polite facades." Hazel Gray, ever sharp, added, "And someone clearly wants to keep those secrets buried, even if it means breaking the law." Thomas Blackwood shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent. Jane watched him closely. "Mr. Blackwood, do you have any idea who might be behind this?" He shook his head. "I cannot say, but I know that Edward's death has stirred a hornet's nest." That evening, Jane received a visitor, a man she had not expected. Mr. Samuel Pritchard, a businessman from a neighboring town, arrived at her cottage under the guise of seeking advice. His manner was polite but edged with urgency. "Miss Marple," he said, "I have heard of your involvement with the Ashgrove matter. I believe I hold information that could be of use." Jane invited him in, her curiosity piqued. Samuel revealed that he had once been acquainted with Edward Hargrove, and that Edward's manuscript, the elusive one he had been working on, contained revelations about financial improprieties, involving several prominent individuals. "This manuscript," Samuel said, "is more than a book. It's a confession, a chronicle of deceit." Jane's eyes gleamed. "And you believe this is why someone wanted Edward dead?" Samuel nodded grimly. "Exactly. And I fear that the break-in was an attempt to seize or destroy that evidence." As the night deepened, Jane and Samuel pored over documents he had brought, their pieces fitting uneasily into the wider puzzle. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the villagers, the faces she had come to know so well, each carrying their own fears and secrets. She pondered the role of Lady Ashgrove and Lord Ashgrove, their calm exteriors perhaps a shield for deeper troubles, and Thomas Blackwood, whose quiet loyalty might conceal silent knowledge. And the next day brought a new revelation. Lucy Bell, the grocer's daughter, came to Jane with a letter she had found tucked within her father's ledgers, a letter from Edward Hargrove addressed to an unknown recipient. The letter was cryptic but urgent, speaking of unseen enemies and the need to protect the truth at all costs. Jane read the letter carefully, feeling the weight of its implications. "This confirms the danger Edward felt," she said softly. "His fears were not unfounded." Days passed, and the tension in Little Hollingbury thickened. Villagers cast wary glances, trust frayed, and the once tight-knit community began to splinter under the strain of suspicion. Miss Marple, however, remained a steady presence, her observations sharper than ever. She understood now that the puzzle of the book that never closed was not simply about a single murder, but a web of deception reaching far beyond what anyone had imagined. And then came the moment Miss Marple had been waiting for, a subtle shift in behavior, a slip of the tongue during a seemingly innocent conversation that hinted at a truth too dangerous to confess openly. Jane quietly arranged a meeting with Hazel Gray, whose journalistic instincts and fresh eyes had proven invaluable. Together, they began to unravel the tangled threads of lies and half-truths, preparing to confront those who would rather see the mystery remain unsolved. The village of Little Hollingbury stood on the brink of revelation. The puzzle was far from complete, but the pieces were falling into place, and Miss Marple was ready to lead the way. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The air in Little Hollingbury was thick with anticipation, as if the village itself sensed that the long-awaited moment of reckoning was drawing near. The usual calm of the countryside was now layered with a tension that clung to every conversation, every glance exchanged in the streets. The subtle games of observation and concealment had reached a delicate crescendo. Miss Marple, ever patient and discreet, had resolved to engage in a quiet but decisive maneuver, one that would reveal truths not spoken aloud, but betrayed through manner and instinct. Her final test was at hand. The afternoon sun cast gentle light upon the village hall, where Miss Marple had arranged a seemingly casual tea gathering. Invitations had been extended to a select group: Lady Ashgrove, Lord Ashgrove, Thomas Blackwood, Hazel Grey, and a few other villagers whose actions or reactions had drawn her attention. The room was warm and filled with the soft murmur of polite conversation, the clinking of porcelain cups, and the faint scent of freshly baked scones. The atmosphere was outwardly serene, but beneath the surface, a game of subtle psychology was underway. Jane moved among her guests with the easy grace of a hostess, her eyes keen and observant. She began gently, addressing the group with a voice light as a summer breeze but firm in its intent. "Thank you all for coming," she said. "In times such as these, it is easy to be swayed by fear and rumor. But sometimes, a quiet moment together can illuminate truths that elude us in the bustle of daily life." Her gaze lingered momentarily on Lady Ashgrove, whose composed expression masked a flicker of unease. Jane continued, "I have been reflecting on the ledger and the coded messages, and I believe that the heart of this mystery lies not only in what was hidden, but in how people respond when confronted with truth." She invited her guests to share their thoughts, subtly steering the conversation toward the events leading to Edward Hargrove's death and the secrets entwined with the puzzle book. Lady Ashgrove spoke first, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. Edward was a man driven by his convictions. He believed the past must be confronted no matter how painful. Lord Ashgrove nodded solemnly. Yet some secrets exist to protect the living, not to punish them. Jane noted the careful balance in their words, a dance of truth and denial. Thomas Blackwood, usually reserved, spoke next. "I have served this estate faithfully, but I admit there were things I wished remained buried. The arrival of Mr. Hargrove upset the balance." Jane's gaze held his. "And did you feel threatened?" Thomas swallowed. "I felt a duty to protect my employer and the village." Hazel Grey then contributed, her sharp eyes never missing a detail. "Sometimes protection becomes justification for darker deeds." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging heavily. Miss Marple then shifted the focus subtly. "Fear, loyalty, and love. These are the forces that drive us, sometimes to acts we later regret." She paused, allowing the meaning to settle. "Lady Ashgrove, may I ask, how did you feel when Edward first arrived with his revelations?" Lady Ashgrove's hands trembled slightly. "I was afraid that our carefully crafted lives would unravel." Jane nodded knowingly. Fear can be a powerful motivator. The conversation continued with Jane guiding the discussion, watching for the smallest reactions. The tightening of a jaw, a fleeting glance, the way a hand gripped a teacup. Her final test was not to seek confession, but to observe the truth that slipped through the cracks of pretense. As the tea drew to a close, Jane proposed a small exercise. Let us each consider the question: what would we risk to protect those we love? One by one, the guests responded, their answers revealing layers of emotion and concealed tensions. When it came to Thomas Blackwood, his voice was quiet but firm. I would risk everything. Loyalty is not always easy, but it is my guiding star. Lady Ashgrove's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I would risk my reputation, my standing, even my peace. Hazel Gray's gaze was steady. The truth is worth any risk. Jane then spoke softly but clearly. Yet sometimes the cost of protection is too high, and the lines between right and wrong become blurred. She turned to the group, her eyes steady. Who among us has crossed that line? At that moment, a subtle shift rippled through the room. Lady Ashgrove's composure faltered, a brief flash of fear crossing her eyes. Thomas Blackwood's posture stiffened, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his cup. Hazel Gray's fingers twitched ever so slightly. Jane allowed the silence to stretch, her mind piecing together the fragments. It was in that pregnant pause, in the smallest of tells, that the final pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Later, after the guests had departed, Miss Marple sat quietly by the window, her thoughts deep and clear. She knew now that the murderer was someone who wielded fear like a weapon, whose desperate need to protect had driven them to commit the unthinkable. The puzzle of the book that never closed was about to be solved. Chapter 9. Unraveling the Puzzle. The morning in Little Hollingbury broke quietly under a pale, silvery sky, the village cloaked in a soft mist that blurred the edges of the thatched roofs and winding lanes. It was a morning heavy with anticipation, one where every footstep echoed a little louder and every glance seemed charged with unspoken questions. The villagers gathered in the old village hall, an aged building of oak beams and worn stone, where history seemed to linger in every creaking floorboard and faded portrait. Today, the entire community waited, with bated breath and restless hearts, to hear the truth that Miss Marple, with her characteristic patience and keen insight, had been quietly preparing to reveal. Miss Marple stood at the front of the room, a small, serene figure in her familiar tweed coat and soft hat. Her eyes, bright and steady, swept over the crowd of familiar faces: Lord and Lady Ashgrove, Thomas Blackwood, Hazel Gray, Reverend Humphrey and his wife Edith, Lucy Bell, Mrs. Clement, and a scattering of villagers whose lives had become entwined in this mystery. She began her address with a calm voice that carried the weight of authority, yet remained gentle, for she knew well that the truth would sting, and that some wounds were slow to heal. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her gaze settling on each listener with unerring kindness. "It is often said that the truth will out, but rarely do we have the patience or the courage to allow it to unfold fully. Today, we will walk together along the path that has led us to this moment, shedding light on the shadows that have clouded our village these past weeks." She paused briefly, letting the silence deepen, then began to recount the story as she had observed it, drawing together the threads that many had missed or dismissed. She spoke of Edward Hargrove's arrival in Little Hollingbury, the man with his vast collection of rare books and the mysterious puzzle book that bore no title but held secrets within its embossed cover. She described the ledger they had discovered, filled with meticulous records that revealed debts, secret payments, and whispered bargains linking several village families, including the Ashgroves. She recounted the break-in at the manor library, the hurried search for something concealed, and the fearful reactions of those closest to Edward, all signs of truths too dangerous to confront openly. The room was silent, every ear attuned to Jane's words as she wove her narrative with gentle precision, revealing the undercurrent of fear, betrayal, and desperation that had underpinned the seemingly peaceful village. She explained that Edward had not come merely as a collector of books, but as a man determined to reveal long-hidden injustices, some viewed as justice, others as vendettas. His manuscript was more than ink on parchment. It was a chronicle that threatened to dismantle facades carefully maintained for decades. Jane then shifted her attention to the ledger, which was the key to understanding the motives behind the murder. The ledger documented financial transactions and debts that implicated influential villagers in dealings they hoped would remain buried. Edward's relentless pursuit to bring these to light had stirred a tempest, and the question that remained was who among them had found the cost of exposure too high. Turning towards Lady Ashgrove, Jane invited her to speak. The woman's usual composed demeanor softened, a tremor of vulnerability slipping through. Lady Ashgrove confessed in measured tones to the fears she harbored about the ledger's potential to unravel not only her family's reputation, but also the social fabric of the village. She admitted that certain dealings, once made in desperation or ambition, had been cloaked in secrecy to protect livelihoods and legacies. Yet, as Jane gently probed, Lady Ashgrove's words revealed a deep conflict. The yearning to preserve her family's honor, and the growing realization that concealment came at a terrible price. Next, Thomas Blackwood stood and spoke of his years of service, the loyalty he bore to Ashgrove Manor, and the burden of guarding secrets not his own. He acknowledged his disagreements with Edward, but denied harboring hatred or motive for murder. His voice bore the weight of quiet dignity, though Jane noted the tension beneath his steadfast exterior. When Jane's gaze settled on Hazel Gray, the young journalist who had doggedly pursued the truth, Hazel met her eyes with a mixture of respect and reticence. Jane's gentle admonishment that sometimes the greatest truths lie not in what is uncovered, but in what is concealed, elicited a nod of acknowledgement. Hazel's eagerness for exposure had brought much to light, yet Jane's insight reminded all present of the complexities that truth entails. With the audience rapt, Jane began to unfold the final pieces of the puzzle. She spoke of the subtle behaviors observed during her recent tea gathering, the quickened breath, the fleeting glances, the tightening of hands around teacups. These small tells, invisible to many, were the silent witnesses to a deeper guilt and fear. She then delivered the revelation with a calmness that belied its gravity. The murderer was Lady Ashgrove herself. The room seemed to hold its breath, faces paling, eyes widening in shock and disbelief. Lady Ashgrove's composed mask faltered, a ghost of anguish passing over her features. Yet she met Jane's gaze with a strange mixture of resignation and dignity. Jane patiently explained the motive, the chain of desperation and love that had led to the unthinkable act. The ledger's secrets posed a threat so grave that Lady Ashgrove had chosen to silence Edward rather than allow her family's past to be dragged into the light. The confrontation in the library, the fatal moment born of fear, the attempt to cover the crime, all had been calculated acts made in anguish. She detailed how Lady Ashgrove had orchestrated the break-in to retrieve the ledger and the puzzle book, believing that destroying or reclaiming the evidence could restore the fragile order she craved. But she had underestimated the steady watchfulness of a woman like Miss Marple, whose quiet persistence had gradually unraveled the layers of deception. As Jane's words settled over the room, Lady Ashgrove's composure broke completely. Tears flowed freely as she confessed, speaking of the unbearable pressure to maintain appearances, the weight of inherited secrets, and the moment when love and fear collided in a fatal choice. Her voice trembled as she lamented the destruction her actions had wrought, not only to a man's life but to her own soul and the community she sought to protect. The villagers listened, some with sorrow, others with stunned disbelief. as the final truth reshaped their understanding of the events and the people they thought they knew. The Ashgrove's carefully curated image shattered, replaced by the raw and painful reality of human frailty and flawed choices. After the confession, a heavy silence settled over the hall. Reverend Humphrey, his voice steady and compassionate, offered prayers for forgiveness and healing. Jane herself reflected quietly on the complexities of human nature, the delicate balance between loyalty and honesty, the shadows that dwell in the hearts of even the most refined, and the power of patience and insight to bring hidden truths into the light. As the meeting dispersed, Jane remained seated a moment longer, gazing out the window at the village slowly stirring under the gray sky. The puzzle had been solved. The book had finally closed. But the wounds left behind would take time to heal, and the villagers would carry the memory of these events like a scar, reminders of the fragile line between appearance and reality. Returning to her quiet garden, Miss Marple felt the familiar blend of sadness and satisfaction that accompanies the end of a mystery. The truth, once obscured, was now clear. Justice, imperfect and often painful, had been served, and in the gentle fading of daylight, the village of Little Hollingbury could begin to breathe once more. The puzzle had tested her keen mind and her deep understanding of human nature. It had proven that beneath the quietest surfaces lie currents strong enough to uproot lives, and it had reminded her, yet again, why patience, kindness, and sharp observation remain the greatest tools in uncovering the truth. Chapter 10. Reflections Beneath the Quiet Sky. The village of Little Hollingbury was forever changed. In the days that followed Lady Ashgrove's confession, the once tightly knit community found itself navigating a new reality. One where secrets, long buried beneath layers of polite conversation and gentle smiles, had been exposed to the unforgiving light of truth. The air that had once been filled with the delicate fragrance of blooming gardens now carried a weight, palpable and heavy, as villagers grappled with the consequences of what had transpired. The morning after the revelation, the village awoke under a sky painted with soft grays and lingering mist, mirroring the somber mood that had settled across the countryside. Shops opened slowly, and footsteps on the cobblestones were measured, as if each step echoed with the echoes of past actions and future uncertainties. Conversations, when they occurred, were hushed and cautious, full of pauses and unfinished sentences that spoke volumes more than the words themselves. Miss Marple moved among her neighbors with her usual quiet grace, her keen eyes taking in the subtle shifts in demeanor, the tightened jaw of Mr. Thompson, the wary glance of Mrs. Clement, the downcast eyes of Lucy Bell. The village was fractured, yet beneath the fracture lay a fragile thread of resilience, a hope that with time, understanding, and forgiveness might take root. Jane understood this well. She had seen many villages face such upheavals, and she knew that the path to healing was neither swift nor straightforward. It required patience, empathy, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths without allowing bitterness to fester. The Ashgrove estate itself was cloaked in a quiet melancholy. Lord Ashgrove, once a figure of calm authority, now bore the unmistakable lines of worry and loss. Lady Ashgrove, having confessed to the murder of Edward Hargrove, was confined to her chambers under the watchful eye of the local authorities, her dignity marred by the gravity of her actions, but her sorrow deep and genuine. Thomas Blackwood resumed his duties with a subdued demeanor, his loyalty to the estate unchanged, but tempered by the knowledge of the shadows that had lurked beneath its grand facade. Hazel Grey, having played a vital role in unearthing truths and assisting Miss Marple, considered her future in the village with a new understanding of the complexities hidden beneath its charming exterior. In the village hall, a meeting was held to discuss the future and the steps needed to rebuild trust and community spirit. Reverend Humphrey spoke of forgiveness and the importance of unity, urging the villagers to support one another in the difficult days ahead. His words were met with nods and murmurs of agreement, though the path ahead seemed daunting. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the back, reflected on the intricacies of human nature that the case had revealed. She thought of the delicate balance between self-preservation and honesty, of the ways fear can twist love into something unrecognizable, and of the courage it takes to face the consequences of one's choices. The village's children returned to school, where Miss Agnes Collins gently guided them through the confusion and uncertainty. She encouraged questions and allowed space for the natural curiosity and apprehension that arose, understanding that the seeds of empathy and resilience were sown in such moments. Lucy Bell found comfort in the company of friends and neighbors, though the memory of her role in uncovering the hidden box and the letters lingered. She showed a quiet maturity beyond her years, a resolve to help her village heal. Miss Marple often spent her evenings in her garden, where the familiar sounds of nightfall, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, offered a soothing counterpoint to the village's tumult. Here, she found space to contemplate the layers of the mystery and the fragile threads of connection that bind people together. She thought of Edward Hargrove, a man driven by conviction but caught in the tides of human frailty. She thought of Lady Ashgrove, whose actions, born of fear and desperation, had shattered lives yet revealed truths that needed telling. And she thought of the villagers, flawed, resilient, capable of both darkness and kindness. The puzzle of the book that never closed had finally come to rest, but its lessons lingered. Miss Marple knew that secrets would always exist, whispered beneath polite smiles and behind closed doors. Yet she also knew that it is in the patient pursuit of understanding and compassion that communities find their way through darkness. As dawn gave way to day and the village of Little Hollingbury began to breathe more freely, Jane felt a quiet satisfaction. The truth had been uncovered, justice served, not through haste or harshness, but through gentle inquiry and steadfast observation. She understood, as she always did, that the human heart is a labyrinth of contradictions, and that the greatest mysteries lie not in the deeds themselves, but in the motivations that drive them. In the days that followed, life in Little Hollingbury gradually resumed its rhythms. The garden parties and village fairs would return, though tinged with a new awareness of the fragile balance between appearances and reality. The villagers carried with them the weight of the past weeks, but also a renewed commitment to honesty and community. Miss Marple continued her quiet walks along the village lanes, her presence a steady reassurance. She listened to stories and shared quiet moments with friends and neighbors, ever watchful for the subtle signs that speak of human nature in all its complexity. And in the soft twilight, as stars began to appear one by one in the sky above, Jane Marple felt the enduring truth settle once more, that in patience, kindness, and understanding, even the most tangled puzzles can find their resolution.